I was 7 when I first understood that love could be kneaded into dough. Standing on my grandmother's wooden step stool in her sun-drenched kitchen, my small hands covered in flour up to my wrists, I watched her weathered fingers guide mine in the ancient rhythm of bread making. Push, fold, turn. Push, fold, turn. The yeast was alive, she told me, a living thing that would transform simple ingredients into something greater than their individual parts. The dough was warm and yielding beneath our palms, and as we worked, the smell of cinnamon and rising bread filled the air like incense in a cathedral. "You feel that, Mija?" my grandmother whispered, her voice carrying the weight of generations of women who had stood in kitchens before us. "That's not just dough you're touching. That's love becoming food. That's how we say things we don't have words for." In that moment, covered in flour dust that caught the afternoon light like fairy dust, I felt something click into place inside my chest. A recognition, a calling. This wasn't just cooking. This was alchemy. This was the ancient art of transformation, of taking the raw and broken and making it whole. The kitchen wasn't just a room. It was a sacred space where ordinary ingredients became extraordinary experiences, where meals became memories, where the act of feeding someone became the deepest expression of care. Years later, I would understand that my grandmother was teaching me a language, not Spanish, which she spoke in rapid, musical bursts, but something deeper, the language of nourishment, the vocabulary of comfort, the grammar of love made tangible. My mother never learned to speak this language fluently. Where my grandmother saw cooking as an art form, my mother saw it as an obligation, a daily mountain to climb, a burden that fell disproportionately on her shoulders. Dinner was a task to be completed, a box to be checked, a responsibility that kept her tethered to the kitchen when she longed to be anywhere else. She approached meals with the same grim determination she brought to laundry or paying bills. Functional, necessary, joyless. "It's just food, Elena," she would say when she found me at 14, experimenting with different spice combinations or trying to recreate a dish I'd seen on a cooking show. "Don't make it more complicated than it needs to be." But I couldn't help myself. While other teenagers covered their walls with posters of bands and actors, I had a hand-written quote from Julia Child taped above my desk. "A party without cake is just a meeting." I stayed up late reading cookbooks like novels, absorbing not just recipes but philosophies, histories, the stories of how certain dishes came to exist. I learned that bouillabaisse was born from fishermen's scraps, that pasta wasn't actually Italian by origin, that the perfect omelette was considered the ultimate test of a chef's skill, not because of its complexity, but because of its simplicity. How difficult it was to make something so basic absolutely perfect. At 16, I attempted my first French dish, coq au vin. I spent my entire allowance on ingredients, stayed in the kitchen for 6 hours, and nearly set off the smoke alarm twice. When I finally presented the dish to my family, the chicken was slightly overcooked and the sauce too salty, but I had never felt prouder of anything in my life. I had taken a recipe from another country, another culture, another century, and made it mine. I had traveled through time and space using nothing but technique and imagination. My mother took one bite and said, "It's very fancy, but next time, let's just do chicken and rice." My father, ever the peacekeeper, smiled and said it was delicious. But I could see in his eyes that he would have preferred the chicken and rice too. Only my grandmother understood what I had attempted. She took a second helping and told me stories of her own kitchen experiments as a young woman. How she had learned to cook not from recipes, but from watching, tasting, and failing until she succeeded. Cooking, she told me that night as we washed dishes together, is the most optimistic thing you can do. Every time you start a new dish, you believe it will be beautiful. You have faith in transformation. That's not just cooking, Mija. That's hope made edible. College brought the inevitable pressure of practical choices. Culinary school, existed in my peripheral vision like a beautiful, impossible dream. Something for people who could afford to take risks, who had safety nets, who didn't need to worry about student loans and health insurance and 401k plans. So I chose marketing instead, a sensible degree that would lead to a sensible career with a sensible salary. But cooking remained my secret life. While my classmates spent weekends at parties, I spent them staging at a small French restaurant downtown. The chef, a temperamental man named Laurent, who had trained in Lyon, initially dismissed me as another culinary tourist. But something changed the day he watched me brunoise vegetables. The knife work, the precision, the way I treated each carrot and celery stalk as if it mattered, which it did. "You have it," he said simply, pausing beside my station. "Le don, the gift." When I asked what he meant, he explained that some people cook with their hands, others with their minds, but the truly gifted cook with their memories and emotions. They can taste a dish and instantly know not just what's in it, but the mood of the person who made it, the story they were trying to tell, the love or frustration or joy they folded into every step. "You taste with your heart," he said. "That cannot be taught." Those weekends became my sanctuary. Surrounded by the controlled chaos of a professional kitchen, the rapid fire French commands, the ballet of bodies moving around each other with practiced precision, I felt more myself than I ever did in marketing classes. Here, creativity wasn't just encouraged, it was essential. Innovation wasn't a buzzword, it was survival. The difference between good and extraordinary often came down to a single inspired choice: the addition of lavender to a honey glaze, the decision to smoke the salt, the courage to pair unexpected flavors and trust that they would sing together. But Monday mornings always came, bringing with them the fluorescent lights of lecture halls and professors who spoke about target demographics and brand positioning. I lived split between two worlds: the vibrant sensory universe of the kitchen and the gray corporate landscape of my real education. Neither world knew the other existed. I met Mark on a Tuesday evening in October, at a coffee shop where I was grading marketing papers and he was reviewing financial reports. Our conversation started with a spilled latte, his fault, and evolved into an argument about whether coffee was better appreciated black or with cream. We disagreed passionately. He had an easy laugh and sharp eyes, and when he asked me to dinner, I surprised us both by saying I'd prefer to cook for him instead. "You cook?" he asked, as if I had claimed to speak Mandarin or perform surgery. "I cook," I confirmed, and something in my tone made him nod seriously, as if he understood that this was important, that this mattered. That first dinner was my audition for love, though I didn't think of it that way at the time. I prepared duck confit with a cherry gastrique, roasted fingerling potatoes with rosemary, and a salad of bitter greens dressed with a champagne vinaigrette. For dessert, a chocolate tart with salted caramel that I had been perfecting for months. Mark arrived with wine and flowers, but his gifts were forgotten the moment he stepped into my apartment. The air was rich with the scent of herbs and roasting meat. The lighting was warm and golden, and I moved through my small kitchen with the confidence of a conductor leading a symphony. He watched me cook the way some people watch dancers, with fascination, admiration, and a touch of awe. He asked questions about techniques, about why I chose certain ingredients, about the stories behind the dishes. When I told him about the duck confit's origins in French preservation methods, about how the slow cooking in fat was a way to make meat last through harsh winters, he listened as if I were revealing the secrets of the universe. "This is incredible," he said after the first bite, and I could tell he meant more than just the food. He meant the experience, the care, the way I had transformed my small dining room into a restaurant. Quality moment. That night he stayed until 2 a.m. and we talked about everything: our childhoods, our dreams, our fears about the future. But what I remember most clearly is the moment he said, "I've never met anyone who creates beauty the way you do. You're an artist, and your medium just happens to be food." An artist. The word landed in my chest like a key finding its lock. For 3 years, Mark was my greatest champion. He would invite friends over specifically to experience what he called Elena's magic, and he would beam with pride as they praised each course. He encouraged me to experiment, to push boundaries, to treat our kitchen as my laboratory. When I worried about the cost of premium ingredients, he would wave away my concerns. "Art requires investment," he'd say, "and you're worth investing in." He proposed over a meal that had taken me 3 days to perfect, a 7-course tasting menu that told the story of our relationship through food. The first course represented our meeting coffee panna cotta with a bitter chocolate aisle. The second, our first date, the duck confit, reimagined as a delicate terrine, and so on through our history together. The ring was hidden in the 6th course, nestled in a quenelle of lavender ice cream, and when I found it, I cried tears that were both joy and relief. Here was someone who understood that my cooking wasn't just feeding. It was my voice, my art, my way of loving the world. "I want to spend my life being amazed by you," he said as he slipped the ring onto my finger. I believed him. We both did. The change didn't happen overnight. It was glacial, so slow that I didn't notice the landscape of our relationship shifting until I looked up one day and realized I was standing somewhere completely different from where I had started. It began when Mark's career in finance took off. Suddenly, our social circle expanded to include his colleagues and their wives. A world of corporate dinners and networking events where conversation moved through stock portfolios and vacation homes like a perfectly choreographed dance. I found myself at dinner parties where I was introduced not as Elena, but as Mark's wife. "She's an amazing cook." As if my identity could be summarized in a dependent clause. The first time it happened, I thought nothing of it. The second time, I felt a small prick of discomfort. By the 5th or 6th introduction, I began to understand that I was being reframed, not as a person with interests and talents, but as an accessory to Mark's professional success. The woman who could host beautiful dinner parties, the wife who made him look good. I remember the exact moment I realized how far we had drifted. We were at another corporate dinner, and I was sharing a story about a dish I'd created. A play on traditional mole that incorporated unexpected ingredients like dark chocolate and pomegranate molasses. I was explaining the history of mole, how it was created by nuns in Puebla, how it represented the fusion of indigenous and European ingredients, when Mark interrupted. "Speaking of fusion," he said, smoothly redirecting the conversation, "did you all hear about the merger between—" And just like that, my story evaporated. The indigenous nuns, the careful balance of 27 ingredients, the 3 days of preparation. All of it dismissed with the casual efficiency of a man who had more important things to discuss. I sat in silence for the rest of the evening, watching Mark hold court, and I began to understand something that would take me years to fully accept. I was becoming invisible in my own life. The shift accelerated after that. My passion, once described as art, was increasingly referred to as my hobby. The elaborate dinner parties I hosted were praised, but the praise was directed at Mark, as if he were the magician, and I merely the assistant who made the magic possible. Friends would compliment him on our cooking, and he would accept the praise with a modest smile that made my stomach clench. When I wanted to take a cooking class in Provence, a week-long intensive with a chef whose work I had admired for years, Mark frowned at the cost. "We can't really afford that right now," he said, though we had just purchased a new BMW. The priorities were clear: his career, our status, our sensible future. My growth was optional. I found my notebook of recipe ideas in the trash one morning. Pages and pages of carefully developed concepts, ingredient ratios I had tested and retested, ideas that had kept me awake with excitement. When I confronted Mark, he looked genuinely surprised. "Oh, I thought it was just old scratch paper. Sorry, honey, just." There was that word again, small and sharp as a paper cut. The night I stayed up until 3 a.m. perfecting a mole sauce. 30 ingredients, 6 different chilies. A complex symphony of flavors that had taken me months to balance. Mark tasted it and shrugged. "It's good," he said, "but it just tastes like chocolate and spice to me." Just chocolate and spice. As if Beethoven's Ninth Symphony was just noise. As if Monet's water lilies were just paint. As if my art, my passion, my careful cultivation of flavor and technique and cultural understanding was nothing more than the sum of its simplest components. It was my best friend Sarah who finally forced me to confront what was happening. She visited one weekend and found me in the kitchen, mechanically preparing what had become my standard company meal. Safe crowd. Pleasing dishes that required no explanation, no storytelling, no risk. "When did you stop talking about your food?" she asked, watching me season a conventional roast chicken with the efficient movements of someone completing a chore. The question stopped me cold. When had I stopped talking about my food? When had I stopped explaining the inspiration behind dishes, the techniques I'd learned, the cultural traditions I was exploring? When had cooking become something I did in silence, in shame, in the stolen moments when no one was watching? "I don't know what you mean," I lied. "You used to light up when you talked about a new recipe." Sarah continued, settling onto a kitchen stool like she was planning to stay until I told her the truth. "You'd call me at midnight because you'd figured out some genius flavor combination. You'd spend 20 minutes explaining why you chose a particular salt or how you modified a classic technique. Now you cook like you're apologizing for it." She was right, of course. Somewhere along the way, I had begun to apologize for my passion. I would preface conversations about cooking with disclaimers. "I know this is boring, but..." Or "I probably shouldn't get so excited about this, but..." I had internalized the message that my interests were trivial, that my expertise was irrelevant, that my joy in creation was embarrassing. The most insidious part was how gradually it had happened. Like a frog in slowly boiling water, I hadn't noticed the temperature change until I was already being cooked alive. The portfolio submission happened in secret, during stolen moments when Mark was traveling for business. For weeks, I photographed dishes in the golden hour light that streamed through our dining room window, wrote and rewrote artist statements that tried to capture the philosophy behind my work, gathered testimonials from the few people who had truly understood what I was attempting to create. The Aurora International Food Award was something I had followed for years but never dared to dream of entering. It wasn't just about cooking. It was about culinary artistry, about pushing the boundaries of what food could be and do. Previous winners had gone on to open revolutionary restaurants, publish groundbreaking cookbooks, change the way people thought about cuisine itself. I almost didn't submit. I would get as far as the online application, my finger hovering over the submit button before closing the laptop in shame. Who was I to think I belonged among such company? I wasn't a professional chef. I didn't have a restaurant or a culinary degree or any of the credentials that seemed necessary for such recognition. But late one night, after Mark had gone to bed and the house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator, I opened my laptop one more time. I looked at the portfolio I had assembled. Photographs of dishes that told stories, recipes that bridged cultures, techniques that married tradition with innovation. And I saw it through fresh eyes. This wasn't the work of someone playing at being a chef. This was the work of an artist who happened to use food as her medium. I clicked submit. Before I could change my mind, the confirmation email arrived immediately, and I stared at it for a long time before closing my laptop and padding back to bed. Lying next to my sleeping husband, I felt like I had committed some small act of rebellion. I had bet on myself. I had declared that my work was worthy of consideration by people who understood art, who understood innovation, who understood that cooking could be more than sustenance. it could be revolution. Then I buried the email in a folder labeled miscellaneous and tried to forget I had ever been so presumptuous. You know, we build our lives inside of words. We construct entire realities, fortresses of identity, based on the things people say to us. And sometimes with just a few syllables, someone can lay siege to the entire structure. For me, those syllables were, "You're just a cook." My husband, Mark, said them. It wasn't during a screaming match, which might have given the words heat and passion that could eventually cool. No, it was worse. It was a casual, offhand remark, delivered with the sterile precision of a surgeon making an incision. We were at another dinner party, one of those sleek, polished affairs where conversation is a currency, and everyone is trading in witty observations and professional accomplishments. The guest list read like a who's who of Mark's professional world. James, a senior partner at his firm. Catherine, a corporate lawyer with aspirations for the federal bench. David and Miranda, a power couple who collected art and vacation homes with equal fervor. The evening had started well enough. I had prepared what I considered one of my more ambitious menus: duck breast with a 5, spice crust and cherry, port reduction, wild mushroom risotto finished with truffle oil, and roasted root vegetables that I had sourced from a local farm. For dessert, individual chocolate lava cakes with a salted caramel scent were technically challenging but pleasing. It was Catherine who asked about my little hobby, her voice carrying that particular tone successful women use when discussing other women's domestic pursuits. Not quite dismissive, but not quite respectful either. The conversation had lulled between discussions of quarterly projections and vacation plans to Tuscany, and she seemed to be making polite conversation to fill the space. "Elena, this meal is absolutely divine," she said, dabbing her lips with the cloth napkin I had starched and pressed that morning. "You must tell us about your little cooking hobby. Do you take classes, or is this just natural talent?" The word hobby stung, but I had grown accustomed to it. I began to explain, tentatively at first, about my approach to cooking as narrative art, about how each dish could tell a story or evoke a memory or bridge cultural divides. I talked about the duck breast, how the 5 spice blend represented the Silk Road, how trade routes had created flavor combinations that seemed impossible until you tasted them together. I was warming to my subject, feeling that familiar spark of passion ignite in my chest, when Mark's laughter cut through my words like a blade through silk. It was a warm, indulgent sound, the kind of laugh you might use for a child who had just claimed they could fly. He reached over and put his arm around me, a gesture that to the outside world must have looked affectionate, but which I felt as a restraint, a gentle but firm pulling back into my assigned role. "Oh, she's amazing in the kitchen," he said to the table, his voice carrying that particular pride husbands use when displaying their wives' accomplishments. Like showing off a prize, winning rose or a well-trained dog. "But let's be real, it's just cooking. You're just a cook, honey. It's charming." The words landed like physical blows. Just cooking, charming. Each word carefully chosen to diminish, to reduce, to put me back in my proper place. The conversation around the table didn't stop. James immediately launched into a story about his last business trip to Singapore. But I caught the quick, sympathetic glances from the women present. They recognized the moment for what it was, a public diminishment disguised as affection. The ride home was silent except for the soft jazz playing on the radio and the sound of tires on wet pavement. Mark seemed pleased with the evening, humming along to the music, occasionally commenting on how well the dinner had gone, how impressed his colleagues had been with the meal, how these social events were so important for his career trajectory. "James asked for your recipe for that chocolate dessert," he said as we pulled into our driveway. "I told him you'd be flattered." I said nothing. What was there to say that I wasn't flattered? I was hollowed out. That his casual dismissal had performed a kind of existential erasure, that he had reduced my act of creation, an act that is, at its heart, a profound argument against entropy, taking disparate, raw elements and weaving them into a cohesive, beautiful, temporary whole, to a mundane task. A service, the psychology of that moment is a cage. When someone you love, someone whose opinion forms the very bedrock of your shared world, defines you in such a limited way, a part of you starts to believe it. It's not that you accept their definition as truth, but you start to live in the negative space around it. You begin to curate your passion in the shadows, speaking about it in hushed tones, apologizing for the time it consumes. Every minute I spent developing a recipe felt like a secret I was keeping, a small theft from the ledger of our marriage. I'd find myself hiding my notebooks, feeling a flush of guilt when he'd come home and find me covered in flour, as if he'd caught me in an act of infidelity. The infidelity, of course, was to myself. I was being unfaithful to my own potential by allowing his definition to become my reality. This is the tragic, quiet part of the story that often gets lost before the triumphant ending. The erosion of self. It's a slow, psychic drowning. I began to see myself through his eyes, not as an artist, but as a service provider, the cook, the feeder, the maker of meals. The magic I felt when I balanced the 5 fundamental tastes, sweet, sour, salty, bitter, umami, on a single spoon, creating a moment of pure, unadulterated sensation, was now framed as a domestic skill. My palate was a kitchen, not a studio. My mediums were perishable, and therefore my art was ephemeral, and in his world, the ephemeral was less valuable than the concrete, the tangible, the things you could put on a spreadsheet. The breaking point, as they often are, was both monumental and microscopic. It was a Tuesday. I had spent the entire day working on a new dish. It was a deconstructed take on a boeuf bourguignon, but I was telling a story with it. A story of our trip to Burgundy, the cold mist on the vineyards, the warmth of a cellar cafe. I transformed the rich, wine-laden stew into a delicate terrine, a powder of dried mushrooms that tasted like the heart of the forest, a jelly of reduced red wine that burst with the memory of sunlight on grapes. It was my memory, my sensory experience, translated onto a plate. It was me, my soul, served in a shallow bowl. He came home late from work, stressed. He glanced at the plate, this thing I had poured my history and my heart into, and said, "I'm not really hungry for this. Art project, can you just make me a sandwich?" Just, there it was again, the final brick in the wall. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. A strange, cold clarity settled over me. In that moment, I saw the architecture of our relationship for what it was, a beautiful, empty house. It had all the right furnishings, the appearance of a life, but it was built on a foundation that could not support the weight of my becoming. He loved the idea of me, but not the actual, evolving, expanding entity that I was. My ambition was an inconvenience. My passion was a hobby that had overstayed its welcome. It was that night, after he'd gone to bed with a sandwich turkey and Swiss on white bread, nothing fancy, that I saw the email. It had been buried in my promotions folder for a week, lost among advertisements for kitchen gadgets and grocery store sales. The subject line was simple, professional, Aurora International Food Award finalist notification. My hands shook as I opened it. Dear MS Rodriguez, we are pleased to inform you that your submission has been selected as one of 12 finalists for this year's Aurora International Food Award. Your work, particularly your essay on culinary storytelling as cultural bridge, building, and your innovative interpretation of classical French techniques through a Mexican lens, demonstrated the kind of visionary thinking we seek to celebrate. I read the email 3 times before it began to feel real. Finalist. They had called me a finalist. Me, the woman who was just a cook, who created art projects that weren't worth eating. The imposter syndrome that had been my constant companion for years whispered its familiar refrains. There must have been a mistake. I didn't deserve this. I was probably the weakest finalist by far. But underneath the fear was something else. Something I hadn't felt in so long, I had almost forgotten its name. Validation. Professional, objective, external validation from people who understood food as art, who recognized innovation when they saw it, who knew the difference between cooking and creating. My heart didn't leap. It didn't pound with excitement. It simply steadied. It was a quiet internal nod. This was the path out of the negative space. The next few days were a blur of logistics disguised as ordinary life. I researched plane tickets to New York during my lunch breaks, opening and closing browser windows like someone conducting an affair. The practical voice in my head, Mark's voice, really kept up a running commentary. It's a waste of money. It's self-indulgent. You'll be embarrassed when you don't win. What will people think? But there was another voice, quieter but growing stronger. What if you do win? What if you don't go and spend the rest of your life wondering what might have been? What if this is the door you've been looking for, and all you have to do is walk through it? I called the number on the email, half expecting them to tell me there had been an error, that my name had been confused with someone else's. But the coordinator was warm and professional, confirming my finalist status and walking me through the details of the ceremony. Black tie event, 3-course dinner prepared by previous winners, presentations by each finalist, judging panel of renowned chefs and food critics. I bought a dress for the ceremony during my lunch hour, a simple black silk sheath that made me feel like someone who belonged in elegant spaces. I hid it in the back of my closet behind winter coats, like evidence of a crime I hadn't yet decided to commit. Telling him I was a finalist was like speaking a foreign language. Mark looked up from his financial reports, smiled that same condescending, charming smile, and said, "That's nice, honey. A fun trip to New York." He didn't offer to come. I didn't ask him to. The silence in that exchange was the loudest sound our marriage ever made. The Aurora International Food Awards ceremony was held at the James Beard House, in a dining room that had witnessed decades of culinary innovation and celebration. Walking into that space was like entering a cathedral dedicated to my chosen faith. The air hummed with the creative energy of hundreds of people who understood that food is not fuel. It is language, it is memory, it is culture, it is love made tangible. I felt like a ghost becoming solid again. The other finalists were intimidating at first: chefs with restaurants, cookbook authors with James Beard nominations, culinary school professors with impressive credentials. But as we talked during the cocktail hour, I realized we all shared the same core understanding, that cooking at its highest level is an art form, that technique serves creativity rather than the other way around, that a single dish can change how someone sees the world. Marcus, a chef from New Orleans, had created a 7-course tasting menu that told the story of the Great Migration through food, tracing the movement of flavors from the South to northern cities. Sarah, a pastry chef from Portland, had revolutionized traditional French techniques by incorporating indigenous American ingredients like pine pollen and sumac. David, a molecular gastronomist from Chicago, had found ways to encapsulate childhood memories in single bites. His grandmother's apple pie transformed into an edible snow globe that dissolved on the tongue. When someone asked about my restaurant, I felt the familiar flush of shame. I don't have one. I admitted, I'm between projects right now. But instead of the judgment I expected, I saw recognition in their eyes. They understood the challenge of being a culinary artist without an institutional platform, the difficulty of creating in isolation, the courage it took to submit work when you had no formal credentials to back it up. The best artists, Sarah told me as we watched the servers prepare for dinner service, aren't necessarily the ones with the most impressive resumes. They're the ones with something genuine to say and the technical skill to say it clearly. Your work says something. I can taste the emotion in it. The presentations were held between courses. Each finalist had 10 minutes to discuss their philosophy, their technique, their vision for the future of cuisine. I watched the others present with the polish of people accustomed to public speaking, to defending their artistic choices, to articulating the theoretical framework behind their work. When my turn came, I walked to the small stage on unsteady legs. The spotlight was warm on my face, and I could see the audience settling into attentive silence. Food critics, established chefs, industry leaders, people whose opinions shaped culinary culture. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Then, I thought about my grandmother's hands guiding mine through bread dough. About the first time I understood that cooking was the language of love. About all the years I had apologized for my passion instead of celebrating it. Food is memory made edible. I began, and my voice grew stronger with each word. Every dish tells a story, not just of ingredients and techniques, but of culture, history, family, identity. When I cook, I'm not just feeding people. I'm sharing my heritage, my experiences, my way of seeing the world. I believe that in an increasingly divided world, the dinner table remains one of the last places where we can practice radical empathy, where we can literally taste each other's stories. I talked about my deconstructed bow of bourguignon, about how I had taken a classic French dish and reimagined it through the lens of my own cultural experience, creating something that honored tradition while pushing boundaries. I talked about the importance of technique in service of emotion, about how the most advanced molecular gastronomy techniques meant nothing if they didn't serve the ultimate goal of creating connection between the cook and the person being fed. When I finished, the applause was warm and sustained. I had found my voice. The moment before they announced the winner, I realized something profound. Just being there was the victory. Standing on that stage, articulating my philosophy to people who understood and respected the art form I loved, I had already won everything that mattered. The external validation was wonderful, but the internal recognition. The moment I stopped apologizing for my passion and started celebrating it, that was transformative. Then they called my name. The world slowed down. The walk to the stage felt like walking out of a shadow I'd lived in for years. The weight of the Crystal Award in my hand was immense. It was heavy with validation, yes, but more importantly, it was heavy with the sheer physical fact of my own existence, separate from him, separate from anyone else's definition of who I was or what I was worth. As the confetti rained down and the cameras flashed, my eyes scanned the crowd, and I saw him. Mark had come after all, a surprise. He was standing at the back of the grand ballroom, his face a canvas of utter, profound shock. It wasn't pride I saw there. It was the stunned realization of a man who had just watched a statue he'd owned come to life and walk away. He had defined me as a small, quiet stream, and in that moment, he was witnessing the ocean I had always been. He tried to approach me afterward, pushing through the crowd of well-wishers and industry professionals who wanted to discuss potential collaborations, book deals, restaurant partnerships. When he finally reached me, his face was a mixture of confusion and something that might have been fear. "Elena, I had no idea," he said, and in those words I heard everything that was wrong with our marriage. He had no idea because he had never bothered to look. He had lived with me for 7 years and never truly seen me. "I know," I replied, and the calm in my voice surprised us both. That was the problem. The week after returning home was surreal. I moved through our house like a stranger, seeing everything with new eyes. The kitchen where I had created in secret, the dining room where I had been dismissed as just a cook, the bedroom where I had shared space with someone who loved an idea of me, but not the reality. Mark tried to recalibrate, sensing that something fundamental had shifted. He suggested we celebrate with dinner at an expensive restaurant, as if the problem was that my accomplishment needed external validation from an establishment with a Michelin star. He bought flowers and champagne and spoke about being so proud of my achievement. But his pride felt hollow, performative. It was the pride of ownership, not partnership. He was proud that his wife had won an award, not that a talented artist had been recognized for her work. "It's wonderful, really," he said over breakfast 3 days after the ceremony. "But let's not get carried away. It's still just. I mean, you can't build a career on this. One award doesn't change practical realities." There it was again, just the minimizer, the reducer, the linguistic prison he couldn't stop himself from constructing around my dreams. That afternoon, I started packing. He found me in the bedroom, folding clothes into suitcases with the methodical efficiency of someone who had already emotionally departed. His disbelief was genuine and complete. "You're leaving? Over this? Elena, you're overreacting. I said I was proud of you. You said you were proud of an achievement." I corrected, not looking up from my careful folding. "That's different from being proud of a person. That's different from actually seeing who someone is." He tried to negotiate, to bargain, to reframe my departure as a temporary emotional reaction that could be managed and contained. He promised to be more supportive, to take my cooking more seriously, to stop using the word just when he talked about my work. But promises to change behavior aren't the same as changing perspective. He still saw my cooking as something he could choose to support or not, rather than understanding that it was integral to who I was. He still thought the problem was his words, not his fundamental inability to see me as a whole, complex person with valid ambitions and authentic gifts. The last call I made from our house was to my mother. I had expected resistance, lectures about marriage being hard work, reminders about financial security and social expectations. Instead, she was quiet for a long moment after I explained what had happened. Then she said, "Mija, I've been waiting for you to remember who you are. Your grandmother would be so proud." And I realized that my mother's relationship with cooking had been complicated not because she didn't understand its power, but because she had understood it too well. She had seen how easily a woman's creativity could be subsumed into service, how quickly passion could be reframed as obligation. She had tried to protect me by teaching me to see cooking as just cooking, not understanding that for me, it could never be just anything. We didn't last, of course. How could we? You cannot return to living in a dollhouse after you've learned you are a giant. The award wasn't the cause of our end. It was merely the proof of a truth that had always existed. The proof that I was never just anything. The divorce was surprisingly amicable. Mark seemed almost relieved, as if my leaving had freed him from the responsibility of pretending to understand something he never could or would. He kept the house, the car, the life we had built together. I kept my knives, my notebooks, and my hard-won understanding of my own worth. 6 months later, I opened a small restaurant in a converted warehouse downtown. The space was raw, industrial, nothing like the sleek corporate environments where I had been dismissed for so many years. The menu changed monthly, reflecting my ongoing conversation with ingredients, techniques, cultural traditions. Food and Wine called it revolutionary. The James Beard Foundation nominated me for Rising Chef of the Year, but the victory that mattered most was smaller, quieter. It happened on a Tuesday evening during service, when a young woman approached me in the kitchen. She had just graduated from culinary school and wanted to stage at the restaurant. "I read about your story," she said, nervous but determined. "About how you won the Aurora Award without formal training, about how you created all this from nothing." It made me think that maybe there's space for different kinds of voices in this industry. Looking at her eager face, I saw myself at 22, full of passion, but unsure if that passion had any value in the world. I thought about my grandmother's hands teaching me that love could be kneaded into dough, about Laurent telling me I had the gift, about all the years I spent apologizing for the thing that made me most myself. There's always space for authentic voices. I told her, "The question is whether you're brave enough to use yours." She started the next week. "So, what is the recipe here? It's not for a prize-winning dish. It's for the self. The ingredients are pain, clarity, and a stubborn, unyielding spark of self, belief that you must protect even when, especially when, those who claim to love you try to blow it out. You are not just your job. You are not just your relationship. You are not just the roles you occupy. You are the unique, irreplaceable essence that chooses to express itself through those roles. Do not let anyone, no matter how loving their intention seems, put a period where a comma should be. Your story is still being written, and it is yours alone to author. Marriage should be a container that allows for growth, not one that demands constriction. Love should make you more yourself, not less. And creativity is not a luxury or a hobby. It is a human necessity, as essential as air or water. The most profound prisons are not made of stone, but of the words we start to believe about ourselves. The most radical act is refusing to live in someone else's definition of who you are. And sometimes, if you're very lucky and very brave, you discover that the key to your prison was always in your own pocket. You just had to find the courage to use it.